This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Hello, ho, ho, ho. You may be gearing up for the festive season, but at the Possibility Club HQ, it is business as usual. I am here exploring the stories of those who are shaping our world through bold ideas and meaningful action. I'm Richard Freeman, hello, and today I'm honoured to have a distinguished guest who has made remarkable contributions to policy, education and social change. With a background that spans frontline politics and advocacy, with big questions about how public institutions can make the biggest positive impact on people's lives. Between 2010 and 2015, my guest served as the Director of Policy to the UK Deputy Prime Minister, then a Mr Nick Clegg, remember him? During the Liberal Democrat and Conservative coalition government. Her work in government laid the foundation for her passion, inequality and social justice. After government, she founded the Money and Mental Health charity in partnership with the money-saving expert Martin Lewis, before going on to lead the policy and democracy think tank Demos. And as of June 2022, my guest has taken on the unique role of Chief Social Purpose Officer at the University of Arts London. In this position, she's championing a groundbreaking initiative, the Social Purpose Implementation Plan, a historic move for any higher education institute in the UK. And UAL's plan goes beyond teaching and research. It's a commitment to how a university can address the intertwined challenges of our time: climate change, social inequality, and the imperative for creativity to drive positive change. We will delve into this core thinking, its priorities, challenges, and the critical importance of embedding social purpose, not only in teaching, but also in global research and university operations. It's a journey towards a more sustainable and equitable future, but how would it work? My guest understands the importance of accountability and measurement, not just about setting lofty goals, but about tracking progress meticulously and ensuring that the entire community is on board. And even though we recorded this interview before my guest launched her very interesting new podcast, How to Win an Election, alongside two lords, Mandelson and Finkelstein, we do obviously spend a bit of time talking about what it is really like for those in power once they get it. This is the Possibility Club, where education meets social innovation, and my guest, I'm delighted to announce, is the ever-fascinating Polly Mackenzie. Hello, this is the Possibility Club, and I'm Richard Freeman. And as always, I've got a brilliant guest talking about change and impact and society and all of the big things that keep us awake at night, but from different perspectives, trying to piece it all together. This is a real treat for me, and this is, I think, about third or fourth attempt because of scheduling and technology, but I'm really thrilled to be talking to Polly Mackenzie, whose career I've watched from afar, from political advisor to chief exec of Demos, really interesting think tank, to now her work at the University of Arts London. We'll explore a little bit of all of those if Polly's up for it. But first of all, the main question, how are you on this sunny Tuesday afternoon in peak school holidays? Your children in the background, my children in the background. It's a funny time of year, isn't it?
It's a funny thing, actually, having worked most of my life in politics and now in academia, is you're really embedded in that term structure. Mm-hmm. You know, Parliament has this big long summer holiday, so do universities. And I feel like most normal people grew out of that. The trimester structure of the year, you know, in businesses, they talk about quarters, Q1, Q2. Here it's terms. You know, and it's terms and it's recess or it's the long vacation. So something actually therefore really nice, though, about that rhythm of the year, because it means there are very intensive periods, kind of a bit like a sprint that you might get in technology, but then some proper time to think and reset. And so actually, I really love that, the slight lull of the summer. The moment I say that, I'm very aware that, of course, lots of my colleagues in higher education are scrambling like Billio right now to deal with clearing, to deal with getting students visas processed, to getting students booked in halls. So actually this kind of latter half of August in the run up to September is, let's not pretend, a hugely busy time for some groups of my colleagues. And I shouldn't forget about them.
Society's rhythms, I always find really, really fascinating. And you can see how parts of our economy and our public and private life kind of congregate around these rhythms, and then others are completely at odds to it and get frustrated by it. So actually, I had those termly rhythms for decades. It's only now running a business with lots of clients in all sorts of different sectors. Am I now going, oh, not everyone does that. So
Yeah.
it's quite an interesting thing to sort of try and adapt to that. How are you finding academia life, working in the university? As you said, you were in sort of a slightly different sort of setting before.
So I've been at University of the Arts London for a year in a new role, and I love creating new roles. But there's this feeling of jeopardy. I have no idea how to do this. And there isn't a model. I can't just follow the instructions. But giving yourself the breathing room and the confidence to keep going, keep plotting, keep asking, keep exploring, keep just writing stuff down. And you will get to the point where you feel like you know what you need to do. And so I did that in a very structured way when I set up a mental health charity with Martin Lewis, the money saving expert, which was my not my first job out of government, my first big job out of government. And that was the first time I'd done it other than by accident. I worked in the coalition as a policy advisor. Oh, and again, nobody knew how to run a coalition, right? Like we were making it up. And so it's been really interesting having built up the confidence that if you keep engaging, keep asking, keep thinking, you will find an answer, not the real answer, right? But the first answer, answer of an iterative model of what you should be doing as a structure and organization. I set myself, I guess, 90 days to figure out what to do in my first year and a year to figure out what to do in my first 5. And that's where I've got to. So in a way, it feels like all I've done is learn and think and talk to people, but have a real sense of what I can achieve in trying to, in simplest terms, help this university to maximize the positive impact it has in the world. And now we just need to do it. But that's the hard part.
It is the hard part. And you're saying figuring out. You're always doing something where basically the rules are being written, things are new, and you had some time to figure out the next phase. Or what does it feel like when you're like, okay, I've got a grasp of this now. I think I know what works and what doesn't.
Any of us who've ever tried to write experience that sensation of writer's block, where you sit, you're in front of a blank piece of paper, and you just feel like, I don't know. There's like a bag, but I don't know how to put the handle on it. I've just got noise in my brain. And then there comes a moment when you can write. I don't know what that is. And sometimes it's actually, there's a sort of external trigger that makes it so essential. There's a deadline. I love deadlines. Mm-hmm. But I remember actually the first job I did out of government was helping Sandy Toksvig to set up the Women's Equality Party. And that was a moment where quite a lot of brilliant minds had been thinking and doing and talking. I mean, only for 3 months or so, but nobody had crystallized that into a plan. And I was actually able to just harness everybody else's thinking and say, and so this is what we will do. And I just wrote. With money and mental health, it probably took me, 3 months because I was starting much more from scratch. But there was just a moment. I think I forced myself into having a deadline of Christmas, and it suddenly felt easier to, because essentially, I mean, great privilege, right? Martin Lewis, who I'd known very, very tangentially for quite a long time, just said to me, I've made this promise to set up an institute and I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. So I said, well, give me 3 months, came back. And this is my best guess. And it felt possible to write it down. And interesting, I was looking through files recently, looking for something else, and I saw what I wrote. And it was remarkably good. It's just sometimes there's a sort of an instinct of sharpness. At UAL, I've been trying, because this is an arts university. Mm-hmm. And I'm a words person. I studied English literature. My deepest loves are kind of poems and speeches and stories. It's not that I dislike art. I don't dislike art. I wouldn't work here. But it's not my medium, the visual arts. So it's been really interesting to kind of push myself to try and think in 3D as well as in words. And so I got a big roll of paper. Actually, the first thing I did, all I could find in the office that was big was like the side of a cardboard box. And I just started like drawing connections and boxes in a sort of matrix of there's these goals and these mechanisms and how do you pull them together? And that got too small. So then I found, oddly enough, right, for University of the Arts London, in our office sections, we don't have any whiteboards. It's really weird. You go to the studios in the art school part, there's like, you know, it's like Creative Central. You go to the offices, it's like, I don't know, third tier law firm. Anyway, we didn't have any whiteboards. So I just drew on the windows, you know, because it's making the connections, isn't it? And then once you have a sense of what's the taxonomy, I love the word taxonomy. When I was running a think tank, that sense of, can you find a language or a structure to describe what's going on? Because often once you get that, you've got a handle to put on the bag, right? Like you've got a way of approaching the problem. And I thought it was in the interest of UAL that I try to draw. So that's where I got to sort of last autumn. The other thing that I really deeply wanted to do is recognize, again, partly because I'm new to this university, is to mobilize 5,000 people and 25,000 students. You can't mobilize them around what I care about, can you? I mean, I'm just one person and I'm a stranger. In what it needed to be to mobilize us is what we cared about as a group. So I wanted to do a big engagement exercise with my colleagues and with the students to work out what we think the art school is for in the 21st century, because I don't think anyone's really figured that out. And so having kind of known what I wanted to do, the question was, what are our values that will inhabit that? And then we did this big consultation process that took the rest of the year.
So I'm interested to know, so what did you find? What came out of that? What is an art school for in the 21st century?
There's a strong sense within our institution, but actually, you know, it's a sort of art school tradition of art as disruption, art as activism. And whether it is paintings, things what you might think of, or the mechanisms of design, or whether it is very pragmatic things like architecture or performance, it's all disruptive. It's the making of something new. And therefore, in the mindset of the kind of people who want to do that, and also the culture that is built when you gather them together into a building or a place, is to be agents of change. And our chancellor, the honorary position at the university, Grayson Perry, has described UAL as the world's largest factory for troublemakers. What we've started to want to talk about is something that is more directional. You know, I think where we are in our political culture is that disruption, which perhaps in the 60s or the 70s was exclusively seen as a sort of the momentum of the left against a conservatism culture, it's very clear now that those who seek to disrupt also include those, you know, it's the chosen methodology of Breitbart, of Steve Bannon, of Trumpism. It's the idea that let's just break all the rules and see what happens.
Liz Truss was disruptive.
Exactly. And so I think in a way, anarchism has developed a branding problem on the left, if that makes any sense. But that you can't just say, smash it all to pieces and see what happens and assume that is a force for good. I sort of think that there's a continuum between art as just disruption, burn it all down, art as activism, which is more directed, or then perhaps art as an act of citizenship, of responsibility. And I think more and more of us are seeing the interconnectedness of the world. You know, you see economic thinkers like Kate Raworth, who writes about donut economics, the idea of living within planetary boundaries. Diane Coyle at Cambridge, who talks about the need for 5 capitals, you know, moving away from a kind of purely financial understanding of what we're trying to build to thinking about natural capital and social capital. And what we've been talking about at UAL in the past has been framed as a justice model, climate justice, racial justice, social justice. But in a way, the challenge with that is that it's always far off. And part of the answer, which is uncomfortable in an art school of disruptors, is to coordinate and to collaborate more. No academic wants to be told what to do by the university, but I think art school academics just like an extra little sprinkling of that sense of artistic freedom. And so the question is, what can we collaborate on where we feel a sense of shared values? And it is first of all, a belief in creativity, the creative disciplines, and that we believe that actually progressivism is driven by imagination and the practical mechanisms of bringing that imagined world to life through picture making and storytelling, but also through design and through build. I want Britain to be a science superpower like the government does, but I feel like they want us to be a science superpower and none of that flaky, wokey, soft stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
When actually, there's no science without creativity. They have to go hand in hand. And if what you love about Britain doesn't include our extraordinary cultural and creative leadership, our ability to build kind of cultural innovation out of this extraordinary multicultural diverse community that we have as a nation, I just think you're missing one of the things that's most brilliant about the country. So making the case for creativity in a world that is refusing to acknowledge it, that's actually really mobilizing for all of us. The next thing is planetary boundaries, right? We are on the brink of something catastrophic. It may be too late to even avert the worst of that. And if we don't learn ourselves to make in a way that is compatible with our planetary boundaries, that is restorative rather than extractive, we're screwed. We're screwed as professions even. The film industry can't go on doing what the film industry does, and the theatre making industry, all of it. And then even more than that, it's that we as storytellers have this ability to change the mindsets of other people. So it's not just about the carbon footprint of the film industry, it's also about the way the film industry can transform what is possible in the collective imagination. And then the other kind of domains in which we feel like we can mobilize together are really about diversity, of course, the multiple forms of human existence and how they all have justice and a desire to drive prosperity in a more equitable model. And so now that we've decided what we knew but hadn't articulated, that's what we stand for, we can then actually start to operationalize change in what we buy and what we do that will help contribute, right? Not solve it, can't solve the world's problems all by ourselves, but we can make what contribution we can reach. And to me, that's citizenship, and it's every human's obligation.
This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible. But who are we?
Always Possible works with ambitious businesses, charities and public services that are thinking about what's next.
From architects to aerospace companies, puppet theatres to primary schools, business networks to big data analysts.
If you're wanting to be brave with some big decisions or to be clearer about what to prioritise, then an award-winning workshop from the Always Possible team is a brilliant starting point.
We care about just one thing: building ideas that work.
For creative, intuitive and practical expertise, consider Always Possible as your strategic partner. Find out more about how we could power up your mission. Visit alwayspossible.co.uk.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Your role feels like a really new and quite brave thing. It's not an academic role. You're in the executive, but usually these executives are about bums on seats and money and league tables. And this feels like, a really interesting space to explore all this, look at what the role is, and as you say, this kind of interdisciplinary stuff. Do you feel that every university, particularly those with a specialism, also need an equivalent to you? UCL with science and Loughborough with sport and Cambridge with all sorts of different things, in which you can have these conversations at a kind of macro level about how universities can supercharge some of the stuff that you've been talking about.
Probably, but you're right. We are going about this in a slightly different way from other universities. We're not exploring things that haven't occurred to anyone else, right? So it's interesting to see, lots of universities who have structured their research strategies around the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. There are lots of universities under the banner of civic universities or anchor universities thinking deeply about their connection with their place and the economies and societies of their place. And of course, there are academics trying to connect their thinking and their work to the realm of policy, to business change, to practical innovations. We're trying to do it in a slightly different way that is attempting to be coordinated and collaborative in a way that I think bridges the divide you've just described. There are universities who've appointed pro-vice chancellors of sustainability or of civic engagement, or things like that. And they have taken somebody from the academic side and given them the responsibility for this kind of organizational change. And there are equally universities who have invested, including who've invested more than us, again, on the sustainability side, but at a professional services level where you might have a director of sustainability with a team and they're engaging across the landscape. I've just learnt that I'm called a third space professional. Apparently that's a thing because I'm not an academic and I'm not, as you say, just in the professional services departments, because in a way I'm trying to catalyse change that goes across this whole waterfront. Two of the big things we're looking at this year is procurement and purchasing, like right in the nitty gritty of operational stuff, and the size and shape of our course portfolio, which is like right at the kind of academic high principle stuff. What others aren't trying to do as much as us is create that bridging function that can speak to both strands. And we might be just wrong. If you're making something, you have to go into it with absolute confidence, but absolute humility to learn when it turns out you've put a foot wrong. You know, I don't mean move fast and break things. Ideally, stop before you break things. But I guess it's called agile, isn't it? Know where you're going and experiment about how to get there. So I would like to think that this model that I didn't design, but James Pennell, my first chancellor, he has built the model. We're trying to make it work. Maybe it will help and others will follow suit. Or maybe it won't at all and we'll be the only ones and we'll be the weirdos. But we'll still have been useful because we'll have demonstrated that it isn't any better this way. So, you know, that's fine.
I can't not ask you about the coalition days. You know, you referred earlier to that being part of that setup. And you're obviously famously very close to Nick Clegg and his office and shaping that a new kind of deputy prime minister from a different party to the prime minister in a way that had never been really tried in the modern times before. You know, all of that feels like a very long time ago. And yet the ripples and repercussions of that and you know, eventually the government, it went on to be for a long time. Everybody's expecting it to change quite dramatically next year, but who knows? You know, looking back at that, you know, what was the measurement of impact at that point? What language, what taxonomy were you using there inside government to know whether things were right or working or not?
I think the honest truth is that we really weren't. And that's not some burn to the Liberal Democrats. It's my experience of politics much more broadly. It is obviously hard for any politician to really create a strategy that's optimized around anything else other than, in the end, their electoral success. This is a real problem. It's one of those just fundamental dysfunctions of democracy, which is why you shouldn't idolize democracy. You know, the old
least worst
cannot just, all it is the least worst form of government. That's a starting challenge. There's then, if I think about how much I have learned about leadership and management in the last 8 years since leaving government, is so much. And yeah, again, that criticism of me, because, you know, I was just before my 30th birthday. Of course, I didn't bloody know anything. Special advisors, in fact, now 29 is pretty old, frankly, for a special advisor. They're just
joined the House of Lords at 29.
Yeah, exactly. So special advisors are being recruited as sort of partisan cheerleaders to keep the spirits up of the minister and shout at people. They don't know anything. And actually, my experience of politicians is the majority of them are well-meaning. I mean, you know, we will all have disagreements and I don't want to be like, oh, they're all perfect and wonderful. But like, they usually have a sense of what they think is in the best interest of the country. But they're not great managers. They're not great they're just, and so they're then utterly reliant on the civil service to figure out the practical delivery plans or push them to clarify what good is. one of the things that troubles me most about the current dynamic between, government ministers and civil servants is that when the civil servants explain that it's complicated, they don't believe them. Mm-hmm. It's assumed that is politically motivated rather than just true. Mm-hmm. Conservatives in 2010 had done quite a lot of preparation for government, and they had a lot of theories about what they wanted to change. The Liberal Democrats had done no preparing for government because we weren't expecting to be in it. We really did make it up as we go along, but we didn't take a considered approach to figuring out how we should operate. We had 2.5 days in which to make most of the decisions that bound our hands for 5 years. So the dysfunctions of politics are many and manifold. And so I've never experienced any of the characteristics of good leadership, really, in my time in politics. And that's what's really sad.
Yeah. So hypothetically, if next year the Lib Dems are kingmakers again, which is not beyond the realms of possibility at all, do you think that everybody that is in the run up to the next election are maybe doing more of that preparation, maybe doing more of that? Okay, what will impact look like for us? What are the theoretical models? What does leadership mean? Do you feel that there might be a bit of learning? Certainly Labour have had enough time in theory to try and work that out. Lib Dems will be eyeing this up, won't they? Thinking, okay, if it's a hung parliament, they're going to need us, and they'll be better than they've done recently, for sure.
I default to a sceptical view. I just don't think it will be in either Labour or the Liberal Democrats' interests to form a coalition. People are working primarily on their electoral goals in the short term. I think Labour are doing some work to prepare for government, but policy making is really difficult. Yeah. And it's really difficult to get out, partly because it's the communications challenge. It's really difficult to get out of that structural habit of focusing on the mechanisms rather than the outcomes. What I find interesting at the moment is this move trying to define mission-led government. That is talking about outcomes, talking about goals, with open-mindedness about the mechanisms. Now, that's really exciting to me because it's much more likely to lead to good, effective delivery and decision-making if you've got that agility, the ability to try things towards a shared outcome, the ability to experiment across departmental or national and local government boundaries. But it is very hard for politicians to stick to because, the voters are sceptical, right? So you say, I'm going to double 5-year cancer survival rates. Mm-hmm. People are like, what? So much easier to campaign on 10,000 more nurses.
Yeah.
Even though literally you could have 10,000 more nurses and they could all just sort of stand in the street not doing anything. And the government would be like, tick. Clearly, what we want is better health. And yet it is so much easier to campaign on and to talk about and for the political journalists to understand the mechanisms. And the problem is that means that over time you just switch until everyone's obsessed with the mechanisms and delivering the specific promise instead of actually recognizing when you've realized that was a dead end and you should have been trying something different.
Yeah. I've heard previous guests on this podcast. I've spoken to Andy Burnham, I've spoken to Matthew Taylor, and both have sort of equally articulated this, their passion for a particular policy, a particular mission at a particular point, but then how badly that's translated into actual, how the general public understand how that has rolled out or not. I've been reading a lot of Mariana Mazzucato recently and her recent book, Mission Economic, which is exactly what you've been talking about there. How do you create really clear objectives about improvement and then communicate that? It really feels like all of that knowledge and wisdom and thought has moved on loads in policy making everywhere outside of politics, outside of the people that are actually making policy, where they're just still caught on this very old treadmill.
It's tough, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I was hoping you'd say, no, it's so much better, but no.
Well, okay, let me say something optimistic, which is that change will come. One of my greatest loves is poetry, and one of my favourite poets is a guy called Arthur Clough, who was friends with a bunch of people who are more famous than him, but whose names I've forgotten out of spite. Anyway, he wrote a poem, which again Churchill quoted during the Second World War, called "Say not the struggle naught availeth." And it's a bit like all of the verbs end in th. So it's sort of a bit poncy and ridiculous. And yet I love it So it said not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the fruits are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been, they remain. And it's this long conceit about say not that everything's shit, because it may be that behind the fog, your fellow travellers are in fact defeating the enemy. And so even though you cannot see the incremental gains, they're not visible to you because of the fog, maybe they're there, so don't despair. And I think hope comes from action. And it ends with westward look, the land is bright. And that's the hope, right? Because the only option is to continue to move forward and make the case. And, you know, this is a podcast that is trying to make the case. And who knows? And it's the ripple effect, because ideas and imagination have power and they're not fast enough. And it's immensely frustrating. And you cannot see when the changes are going to come because of that dratted fog. But the alternative to hope is despair. So let's stick with hope.
Arthur Clough, did you say?
Arthur Clough, great guy.
Well, my chat with Andy Burnham was mostly about Tony Harrison and how his poetry on class and language has shaped so much of basically the policy in Greater Manchester over the last few years. That is where they're slow, but those ideas and that imagination does ripple out. Let's stick with hope, not despair.
Yeah, just before anything bad happens.
For sure. Absolutely fascinating to chat with you. Really interesting to hear about the approach by the University of Arts London and some of the big things you're tackling, but in ways that are tangible and inclusive and, iterative. It's a good word. Thank you for being on the Possibility Club, Polly Mackenzie.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Possibility Club, Practical Bravery. If you enjoyed this episode, do like, share, review, tell everybody about it. Look in the show notes for all the details of today's guest, stuff we talked about, stuff that's of interest, new things to read, new things to listen to. And if you are running a business or a charity and you are trying to accelerate or improve the impact that you have in the world, if you want to be famous for what you do and what you change rather than just what you sell, then talk to us. alwayspossible.co.uk. We want to hear from you, we want to talk to you, we want to amplify and elevate your ideas, and who knows, we might be able to help you feel more confident and clear about what's next. alwayspossible.co.uk. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new special guest and a new insight on practical bravery in action.
The Possibility Club is an Always Possible podcast. The interviewer was Richard Freeman for Always Possible, and the producer and editor was me, Chris Thorpe Tracy, for Lo-Fi Arts. Have a good week.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Lo-Fi Arts.
The custodianship of the Nintendo Switch is one of those very important things on which, if only Eleanor Ostrom had written about it in her work on the governance of the commons, I think all parents would be happier.
Amen to that. Technically, the Switch in our household is owned by my wife.
I don't even know how to press stop. I think it just stops when I hang up.